You're watching Capital City Sunday.
The latest negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza have the support of the United States and most of the international community, but Hamas wants to change some of the terms proposed and is now demanding a full Israeli military withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Joining us now on the show is UW-Madison professor and international relations expert Jon Pevehouse. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jon, with the latest developments this week, where does Israel, Hamas, and the United States currently stand on these peace negotiations?
Right. So earlier in the week, the United Nations Security Council approved a Biden administration plan for a ceasefire that moves in multiple phases in the conflict. It starts with a 6-week ceasefire with some exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, allows the Palestinian population to move back in parts of Gaza, gets Israel out of part of Gaza. Right now, there's sort of two sticking points. One is a big political sticking point, which is that, as American Secretary of State Blinken indicated earlier, he believes Hamas has kind of reneged on some earlier promises that they'd made. And on the Hamas side, they're concerned that Israel has not really publicly endorsed this plan as strongly as they'd hoped that they would.
And Jon, Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visits to the Middle East, do you think that they have helped move these negotiations along?
I believe that they have. You know, it's been the United States, Qatar, and Egypt as sort of the main go-betweens. And that's another thing to remember. Hamas and Israel will not be in the same room with one another because both, frankly, well, Hamas certainly denies Israel's right to exist. And so you've had these intermediaries and interlocutors going back and forth. I think the shuttle diplomacy that the U.S. has helped promote with Qatar and Egypt has helped push these along. Obviously, we're not there yet. I still think some details need to be worked out. But in a world where the U.S. isn't playing a role, I think we would be in even worse shape.
Jon, how will the death of Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi impact existing tensions in Israel and the Middle East? Is this going to add to the political pressures that we've seen since the October 7th attack?
It's possible, I think unlikely. I think that the way it could exacerbate tensions is if you see a competition for leadership in Iran itself, and that part of that competition becomes about who can be the most harsh to Israel, who can strike American interests in the region. If that's not what the fight becomes about, and there are many things the fight in Iran could become about. There's a tremendous amount of social upheaval in that country over the last few years. There's economic uncertainty in that country. Like any election or political system in any country, there's lots of issues at stake. But however, if one of the key issues becomes who can sort of be the most militant on these international political issues, then you could see this spilling over into either the Hamas-Israel negotiations or the Hezbollah-Israel situation on the Lebanese border, which we've seen flame up recently as well.
Obviously, this conflict has been a major issue for people on both sides. With the presidential election just a few months away, how should voters respond to President Joe Biden's response to this conflict?
Biden has been under significant pressure both across the political spectrum and even within the Democratic Party, obviously with part of the party leaning heavily towards sort of a pro-Israel or supporting Israel, and now a growing part of the party being very critical of Israel and supporting the Palestinian people. So Biden has a balancing act. And to me, this was why he really turned up the heat on Israel and trying to indirectly turn up the heat on Hamas to try to reach some ceasefire agreement. The best news for Biden right now on this conflict is no news, right? And it's to keep it out of the headlines so he can focus on other domestic issues. This is, in a way, it's a distraction. And what you've seen in past presidents, whether it was Trump or Clinton or Obama or Bush, they kind of all come into office wanting to do something about the Middle East. And by the end, they really have their hands off of it because they know that there's so many different constituencies and interests in this country and around the world that it's a very hard situation to come up with a winning coalition to really make great headlines about. So right now, the whole point of the ceasefire is let's get the violence stopped, let's start some aid flowing in, and it'll be kind of quiet and hopefully, as the election nears in the United States, not a big political issue.
Jon, obviously a very complex issue. Jon Pevehouse, UW-Madison professor, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, an immigration expert weighs in on the root causes fueling the conversation about immigration on both sides and if they'll ever be able to see eye to eye.